Hey guys, my name is Skylar and I am in my first year of the MFA Performance and Acting program here at UNLV. I'm originally from Northern California. I grew up there. I've spent the last 4 years in Los Angeles and just got here to Vegas. So jumping right into the questions, my favorite stage show. This is such a tough question because I think I've seen shows live that maybe wouldn't necessarily be my favorite show themselves, but the performances were phenomenal. For example, I saw Forrest Whitaker in a Eugene O'Neill play on Broadway, and I couldn't even remember the name of the play, but I just remember how I felt in it and how phenomenal Forrest Whitaker was. But so that's was an amazing experience on seeing the stage, but it wasn't my favorite show. I think my favorite would probably be maybe Constellations by Nick Payne, or anything. I've been loving Teresa Rebeck, the Understudy and Seminar, two of her plays that I absolutely love. So most of the time I tend to pick really character-driven theater shows that are like two-handers or a small cast where you're really getting a deep dive into a character. That's what I'm drawn to, which is not surprising. And what attracted me to acting? I actually didn't really start acting until a bit later in life. I wasn't a theater kid growing up. I discovered acting, through a series of other performing stuff I had done, and I really realized that acting was sort of one of the unique opportunities to create stories that actually, in my opinion, can do something to move forward a polarized rhetoric, or when you look at the way the news kind of creates these enclaves of people who feel like, they feel like they're getting farther and farther away from humans and humanity. I think acting is a tool in storytelling of, comedies or dramas or movies or stage that actually brings us closer as human beings to one another. So that's sort of what drew me to it as an art form. And then I think uniquely, I just have a desire to, I'm not afraid, I guess desire is probably not the right word. That sounds terrible. I'm not afraid to kind of expose myself emotionally or be vulnerable in front of other people. And so that's, early on when I was first discovering acting and my technique, I realized that was kind of something that oftentimes can hold people back from acting. I have my own limitations in other ways, but that didn't happen to be something early on. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. When did I first perform? So I jokingly say that I grew up performing. My dad reminds me that, I played sports as a kid, but I told him, one day I was playing softball and I told my dad I didn't want to put on that costume again, and I was referring to my uniform, and then I would put on fully devised productions of the Spice Girls albums as a kid, and I would force my family to watch them. But my actual first, real performance was in college. I was a dancer, and they were casting the musical and they needed more dancers, and so that is when I showed up and I kind of had my first taste of it. And how do I prepare for a role? So I think this question is great. It fully depends on what the role is, how I prepare for it, and what medium it is. So I've actually done a lot more on camera and film work than I've done stage work, and I think the process for getting into the role is similar, but you have to kind of account for different things depending on which medium it is. So for stage work, I usually start with kind of an Adler-based technique, which is reading the entire play, understanding about the playwright, when the play was written, when it takes place, and then sort of dive into what the actual history of that time frame is, and any social, political issues that might be affecting, what this plays in response to, and really try to understand the big story, what is the story I'm telling, and then And then I start to back into, what is my part in that story. And I do this. I heard Jessica Chastain does it, and so I stole it from her in an interview. And I know it's a popular technique across the board, but I write down everything the playwright says about me, my character, everything I say about myself, and then everything other characters say about me, and that kind of develops for me this three-dimensional look at who this character is, and that's what I usually use to start creating character choices. So I'll really, before I even try to say how I might say a line, or what's going on in what scene, which first of all, I think you should never play the text, as that's called, which is like having an idea of how a line should go. So that's my first approach to acting, is Adler-based, which is using the text to tell me about this character and who I am and how I respond and what I think about myself and what other people think about me. And then when I memorize lines, I try to do them very neutrally, so I don't get married to a certain delivery. And then I use Meisner technique, which is, he's all about responsive acting, and that's for me, the reason I really gravitated towards that was this idea that if you are always responding truthfully, it's always the audience will always feel it's authentic, even if it's not maybe what you would think to say on a certain line. But if you're always putting what you're actually going through, what you're actually feeling onto the text, it'll never feel acty. It feels real, and you can discover some interesting things. So I try more to use Meisner technique. And sometimes I'll do some other work and whatnot to try to get a beat by beat look at what's going on in the scene. I personally don't do that often, but I've worked with actors who do. And how I warm up is, again, depends on the role, but oftentimes I like to create music or playlists to get me into the kind of state of mind of this character that I might be playing, as well as, stretching, body warm-ups, physical, what have you. And then I just try to stay loose. I think sometimes actors can kind of get really locked into their head, and then that's when you start to overthink things or forget things. And I always I think the funny thing is I never get nervous, but then I'll always get nervous that I didn't double check a prop correctly, or that something so we all kind of have our things, I guess. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking about myself so much. The last thing I do before I step out on stage, before the curtain goes up, is breathe. I just breathe. And then as an actor, I always just remember my moment before, which was as a character, what was I just doing, and where, what was I coming from? And I try to remind myself of the stakes of the scene, and just, give yourself that emotional trigger of whatever you need to know to go into the scene. What have I learned from directors that I've worked with throughout my career? I've learned a lot from directors. I think I've learned how to play well with others. I think a lot of times actors get really married to our own idea of what we think a scene should be, or what we think our characters are doing. And I think a director's job, if they're doing their job well, is they oversee the whole story. And so sometimes I've learned that you have to stay open to understanding how your role might need to be different than what you think, but always defending your character's truth. I've also learned about directors so much. It's every project I probably pick up something different from a director. That's such a great question. I'm trying to think of a very specific story I might be able to tell. One director that I really loved, we did a lot of work in building our imaginary and dramatic imagination circumstances of what our characters were going through outside of what was happening in the story. And then that way we could develop a shorthand together of, when we're in a scene together and we need to richen it or find something new, we could always say, okay, remember this, or remember that moment. And by doing it together, we had developed this really unique kind of conversational ability to talk about our characters outside of just what was happening on the stage. The hardest thing about acting is probably, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. The hardest thing about acting for me is, I could answer this many different ways, but the first thing that came to mind was the hardest thing I had to learn was how to not judge characters that are different from me, because I think as soon as you start to judge a character, you can't play them anymore. And so really being able to separate your own personal beliefs and your own personal experience from a character so that you can develop a story for them that you believe in and that you can play them with really and truly no judgment. I think I keep mentioning film stuff, but I think in the O.J. Simpson, the FX version with Cuba Gooding Jr., who plays O.J. Simpson, I thought that was such an incredible job of showing that, of playing an actor who's playing a character with no judgment, because I think that's a very easy role to come up with your own, to have an opinion about it, and to be able, but for him as the actor to go in and play it as genuinely and authentically as, I think a lot of times the best villains can do that and find the humanity. So I guess I'm saying the hardest thing about acting is being a villain for real, but I think it's awesome. My favorite thing about acting is that you have an opportunity to validate someone else's experience, to give a voice to someone whose voice hasn't been heard, to preserve history, to tell stories that matter. It's the most rewarding thing in the world. And I think, in my personal experience, I've been fortunate enough to do shows that I felt passionately about the issues, the way that the story affected an audience, and getting that instant feedback right after, of having people come up to you and thank you for putting that up on a stage and being, brave enough to do it. It's the best feeling in the world. Okay, that's so much about me. I really hope that some of that was useful, and yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys.